This video will teach you how to evaluate the method and suggest improvements for your Criterion C lab report. So it will be this slide. It's the last slide on your lab report, and it's assessed on columns 4 and 5, so the last two columns on the rubric. So some vocabulary that you'll need before we get started. Evaluate means to judge, grade, or assess. The method is how you did the lab, so specifically the procedure and the data collection. To suggest is to put forward for consideration. So I might suggest a restaurant or suggest that you pay attention during class so you know what's going on. It's just a suggestion. And then improvements are things we can do to make something better. So congratulations, this is the last step of your lab report. You've completed a lot of hard work, and you just have one more thing to finish before you are completely done. So things you're going to need to fill out the method evaluation and improvement slide are your procedure and your data tables. You'll also need to use your memory to think about things that you did during the lab. So you're going to have to be reflective and willing to accept that you made some errors that affected your data. Do not worry. You don't have to redo your lab or start over. We are being reflective. We're being honest about the mistakes we made so that we can avoid them in future experiments. Every single scientist who has ever done a lab ever looks back on it and thinks about, what did I do that might have affected the results of my lab? Nobody is perfect. And especially, I don't expect you to be perfect as a 7th grade scientist. You made mistakes. It's not a big deal. We're going to be reflective and think about them today. So one thing to keep in mind before we continue, when we're talking about an error in a science experiment, it's not technically a mistake. I know I said mistakes on the last slide, but an error is different than a mistake. So for example, the marble rolling off of the table is a mistake, or forgetting to do multiple trials is a mistake. It's not an error. Failing to follow your procedure is a mistake, not an error. So let's look at some examples of errors to help you understand them a little bit better. So when I demonstrated our motion lab in class, I made a lot of errors in my data collection method. So here's some examples. The marble didn't always start in the same place. That would affect my data. The marble did not always hit the cup in the same place or at the same angle. That might affect my data. The ramp was not attached to the binder, and it could slide up or down during the lab, which changed the angle of the ramp. That might affect my data. And then sometimes the marble hits the cup twice, or it would push the cup after the first hit, and that would affect my data. You can write about any of these errors if it is true for your lab, or you can come up with your own. These are just some that I came up with, and we're actually going to use a different example in the video. So the error that we're going to use in this video, however, is that sometimes the ramp would flop open, and that would change the position of the marble in the ramp. So now that I've identified the error, I can put it on my table. So I know that we talked about that we would explain the difference between an error and a mistake. Basically, errors are things that affect your data. These are not mistakes or things that you should have fixed during the procedure. They are things that affect the data. So I'm going to put my error right here, and I'm going to say an error in my method was that the ramp was not secured, so the ramp opened sometimes. I'm just explaining what happened in this column, in this error column here. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the significance of the error. So when we look closer, we can see that errors can have a low, moderate, or high significance to our data. So what does that mean? Well, significance is a measure of how important something is or is not. And then another word we may not know is moderate. Moderate means medium. It can also mean average in amount, intensity, quality, or degree. So it's not a big deal, and it's not a huge deal. It's like in between. So to decide this, I have to think hard about how my error could have affected my data. And I have to remember what happened in the lab and imagine what might have happened if I hadn't had the error. So if you look at my two pictures here, this is kind of what it should have looked like, and this is what it sometimes looked like. So I have to think about, how was my data different when it was doing what it was supposed to do versus what it was doing when I had my error, when I didn't have my ramp come at the right angle. So errors can have a low, moderate, or high significance, kind of like an impact on the data that's collected in the lab. So basically, if you decide that an error has low significance, that means that it didn't really change the data much, or it didn't change it in a way that changes the results of the lab. A moderate error changed the data a little bit and might show up in the data, but it'll probably get evened out in the data processing. So it might have really only affected 1 or 2 trials. And then finally, high would be like, that totally messed up the data and it affected the results of the lab even after data processing. So often when you find out that your hypothesis was incorrect, it's possible that you had a lot of errors that had high significance and it messed up your data. So when I look at that table, I guess I decide that changing the position of the marble in the ramp is a moderate error, because it might change the speed of the marble going down the ramp. Slower marbles would deliver slightly less force, so that would have an impact on my data, but it probably wouldn't change the results of my lab. I might have 1 or 2 trials where the data is a little bit less than what I was expecting when my ramp was working the way it was supposed to work. But overall, it's not really changing the results of my lab. So I'm going to put that explanation here on my chart, and I say this error has moderate significance because it changed the speed and force of the marble hitting the cup. So again, I'm saying, is it low, moderate, or high? Well, I decide it's moderate, and then I'm briefly explaining why I think it's moderate. It changed the speed and the force of the marble hitting the cup, so that's going to affect my data. So finally, we're on to improvements, this last column right here. This one is hopefully pretty easy to fill out. So improvements are ways that you can fix the error you wrote about if you were to do the lab again. So the improvement is related to the error, in case that's confusing for anybody. Your improvement is not about something new, it's about the error you wrote about. So improvements need to be specific. You cannot just write do better or try harder. I will give you a lot of feedback. I will give you negative feedback if you write do better or try harder. You need to tell me how you're going to do better. You need to tell me how you're going to try harder. So improvements also need to be realistic, but that doesn't mean you can't suggest materials we don't have. Just please don't suggest things like lightsabers and time machines. If you are suggesting that we, I could suggest that we make a ramp out of metal so that it can't fold up. That would be an improvement that would be realistic, but we just don't have those materials yet. So I'm going to put the improvement that I came up with on here. And what I wrote was, an improvement to the way I do the lab next time would be adding more tape so the ramp will stay open at the same angle the whole time. So that is something that I could do next time if I were to do the lab again. So you guys did it. You wrote a complete lab report with both criterion B and criterion C parts. So once you have that completed, you can submit your lab for grading. You'll get some feedback, and then you'll get an opportunity to revise and improve your lab report before your summative. All right, time for some well-deserved relaxation time. Oh yeah.